The Terror by Dan Simmons, an historical novel that combines horror, fiction, and nonfiction. It was an amazing read, and I enjoyed it because while I was reading the novel, I was also watching the 10 episode series on Prime that's also called The Terror. The novel was written in 2007. It's interesting because at the back of the book, Dan Simmons included the resources that he used to put together his story about the Franklin Expedition and what he developed into his novel. We have a variety of different elements, not only the historical information and the time period when this expedition actually occurred, but then Dan Simmons adds a variety of different twists and information to it. The Prime series was equally enjoyable, and I found out about both of these actually when I had to go to Best Buy and I was upgrading my laptop. So not only did I get a great piece of tech that has come in so handy for me in helping me to get organized and be able to do a variety of different things, but thanks to the person who I was dealing with, and we got to talking about, I was, doing YouTube and needed something for videos, etc., and about books. And that's how I found out about the Terror and the Prime series. So it was great. I got great tech and a great read and a great watch. Win, win, win. I enjoyed the book more than the series. I have to admit, it was rather interesting as after watching the show and reading the book, I began to look into the Franklin Expedition. I have to say, the people who did the Prime series did an excellent job of picking their characters because, as you can see, the actor that they picked, Jared Harris, actually does look a bit like Francis Crozier. That's a picture from Trapped in Terror Bay, Solving the Mystery of the Lost Franklin Expedition, and this is by Sigmund Brouwer, and it's published by Kids Can Press. And I'll talk a bit more about that book. In The Terror, both the TV and the book versions, we start off before they're leaving England, all the different things that they had run into and the problems, the different events that occurred, partly because of the tinned goods that they had, and keeping in mind, tinned goods were something new in this time period. So it isn't like today where we just take that luxury for granted. This was something new and changed things for the expedition. The reason that it took so long before anyone went to try and find these men was the fact that they had the tin goods, so no one was worried about them not having food or anything terrible like that happening to them. Unfortunately, what they didn't know, because again, you have to factor in what was going on in the world at that time. There were no satellites, there were no cell phones, there were no computers. There was no way for people to know what was happening to all these men up in the north. They also had no idea that it was one of the worst winters on record. So the ice conditions were very different than what they had expected. For those who look into such things, this is also the same year of the Donner Party and some rather horrific events that occurred within the United States as that group was trying to make their way across land. So it was quite a year. So in both of those scenarios, things did not go well. As I say, it was one of the worst winters on record. But unlike now with the satellites and everything else that we have access to, In this time period, they didn't have any of those things. So it was quite a thing to be out on these huge ships in areas that were completely uncharted. They didn't even know the shape of the land at that time. When they set out, they were thinking they would be able to do this relatively quickly. They were confident that they knew what they were getting into. No one could have foreseen the horrific events that these men were going to experience. There are a number of interesting things about the novel and the show and the real events that occurred. So, although it was called the Franklin Expedition, Franklin himself passed away fairly early on. Not in the same way it was portrayed within the books and the TV, but he did die early on. One of the first people to pass away was a young man named John Torrington, and that is portrayed in the book, in the TV series, and it was an actual, what they figured was a fact once they found the bodies up in the Arctic. Now, part of the reason they could come up with what was going on during this expedition is because of the conditions. And when these men were buried, they were literally still frozen basically in time. The Prime series, The Terror, which I believe is based on the novel by Dan Simmons, obviously has some differences from the novel. Not only because you're trying to take this huge novel and condense it into 10 episodes, but because you're also trying to tell the story in a climate that is very different. So there were major storms, you have the ice to factor in, these ships that are trapped in the ice, all of that type of thing. Then there's also the legend of what is this monster and how do you present that in a book, which was much more detailed and I preferred, versus trying to bring that into a TV show and how do you present it there as well. Some of the characters and their behavior was far more dramatic in the TV show than it was actually in the novel, which is why I think I preferred the novel. I mean, in either case, based on or the novel, you're having to take your best guess because unfortunately no one actually knows what happened to all of these men. The ships had been lost for such a long time. It isn't like now where people had cell phones, etc. There was no way to get in touch with them. It had been years before anyone had even gone to look for them because with the canned goods, there wasn't that concern of the men starving to death. People just figured there was some issues with the ice. They hadn't gotten through as quick as they had hoped, and they weren't overly worried. I mean, some people were. They wanted an expedition to start much sooner than it did, but others weren't that concerned because they knew they had food. The ships had been enhanced. They figured everything was great and that they would hear from them shortly, which unfortunately they didn't. So all of it is really speculation and people taking their best guess because, of course, we'll never actually know all the specifics of what happened. There are some things that they can put into sequence based on different bits of information that they've come across. But other than that, what these men went through or how they behaved or the choices they made are really all speculation. So after reading The Terror and watching the series, I decided to start looking into the actual Franklin Expedition again. It had been a number of years ago that I had read a book, I believe it's called Frozen in Time, and it has the picture of John Torrington on the front of the cover. His image is one that if you've ever looked into the Franklin Expedition, you'll be familiar with. He was the young man who they found frozen in the ground. He's actually one of the first bodies that they found. If you're interested in learning more about the Franklin Expedition, Trapped in Terror Bay by Sigmund Brouwer is an excellent resource. Although it's written more towards kids than adults, there is a lot of amazing information in here. There's the timeline, there's maps, there's a variety of wonderful pictures. Because it was published in 2022, it has the most current information about the expedition. It talks about the science behind trying to figure out what happened to the men. As I say, it has timelines along with the maps. It's a great way to find out more information about what they believe happened, because even in this case, they can only speculate about the different things that went on and who did what role. There are so many different unfortunate things that happened in this situation, as in not knowing it was the worst winter that was coming, as in believing that the tinned goods that they had gotten had proper food in them. So unfortunately, the man who had gotten the contract to prepare this food didn't have a clean factory. The people preparing the food, there weren't all kinds of rules about cleanliness and sanitation. One of the big things that people believe is that sadly many of these men were poisoned because of the contents of the food. So here was something that the people in England had thought they were fine because they had these tinned goods. Tinned goods could last so much longer than all the other things. But unfortunately, there's speculation that it was the tinned goods that ended up making many of them sick. Of course, they also had issues of scurvy, not proper vitamins. Up north, they weren't getting the sunshine and all that type of thing. So there were so many different factors that were involved. Another thing about all of this, of course, is that the expedition was led by Captain Franklin, which really didn't make a lot of sense. If you read the different information, Franklin had been on an expedition on land that hadn't turned out very well. And really, if you read about Crozier, he should have been the one, I think, who should have been put in charge of the expedition. Unfortunately, the reason that Captain Crozier, even though he'd been down in Antarctica not long prior to this, and he'd done quite well down there, he had experience in that type of environment. He had years of experience in working his way up the ranks. But unfortunately, and again, this speaks to the era and the time period, Crozier was Irish. So unfortunately, in the British Navy, that meant that he had reached the top of where he was going to be, and Franklin ended up being put in charge of the expedition instead of Crozier. Now, of course, we'll never know whether Crozier would have decided to take a different route or what have you. Everything after they left Greenland and were never seen again is left to speculation. But Crozier is one who may have survived the longest. There are stories from, I believe it's the Inuit in that area, who did have a name for him in their language, he who takes long strides. So he may well have been known to the people in that area. And again, if there had been better relations between the explorers and the indigenous people, then they may have found the ships much sooner than they did. So to me, the Franklin expedition isn't just about going out and exploring new boundaries and discovering new lands. It's about the importance of human relationships, regardless of where we come from or any of that. It's the importance of working together as one unified humanity. There are so many different things to that story, whether you're looking at the factual, what happened. There's a website also, if you Google the Franklin Expedition, there's quite a bit of information out there. You can actually see some video of them finding the Erebus and the Terror and the different discoveries that they've made, which is fascinating. It, of course, is not easy work because of the location where it is, ice and temperature, all of that is a factor. So whether you enjoy reading The Terror, the fictional version of what happened, or if you're interested in learning about the actual Franklin expedition, as I say, you can do a Google search. There is so much information out there. It's definitely checking into, enjoying the read. Let me know in the comments down below whether you've read The Terror or you've watched the show, and did you have a favorite? Like I say, I preferred the novel because it got so much more into the legend of what this monster creature was, and also has a different ending than the show. And I'm not going to give away either one, but I preferred the ending in the book myself. If you've enjoyed this video or found it to be of benefit, be sure to give that like button a tickle. Be sure to leave me a comment, perhaps if you've looked into this subject or if you've enjoyed the video down below, as both of those things help my channel get out to other people. If you enjoy content of a bookish nature, nature videos, or silly cats on Fridays, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you know when I upload content that may be of interest to you. Until next time, stay warm and take good care.